noise from my son?
We are live. So I did not hear your son. So the way it's gonna, we're just live, everybody. Hi, I'm Julie Gerstenblatt. I am here with Jessica Shattuck for a special interview today. Jessica, welcome. I'm gonna read your bio and then we'll get talking. Jessica is the author of the novels Last House, The Women in the Castle, a New York Times bestseller and winner of the New England Book Award, Perfect Life, and The Hazards of Good Breeding, which was a New York Times notable book, a Boston Globe Best Book of the Year, and a finalist for the 2003 Penn Winship Award. Her fiction has appeared in the New Yorker, Glamour, Open City, and the Tampa Review, among other publications. And her other writing has appeared in the New York Times, Mother Jones, Wired, The Believer magazine, and the Boston Globe. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you so much for having me. It's so fun to be here. I am a big admirer of A Mighty Blaze and delighted to be on the show.
We're happy to have you. I have come out of retirement from the Blaze for this interview because Jessica and I met about a month ago when I interviewed her here in Barrington, Rhode Island, where I live, for Last House. And because I loved the book and because I'm comfortable talking about it, I was like, I can come on and do this interview. So here we are.
Well, I so appreciate it.
It is my pleasure. So let's start with just telling everybody a little bit about the book. If you could tell us about Last House and how did you come to write it?
So Last House is a multi-generational family saga. It follows 3 generations of the Taylor family, and it starts in kind of the Red Scare of the 1950s and the height of the Cold War, and then moves through the next generation who come of age during the Vietnam War protests and the student activism in the late 60s, early 70s. And then finally it moves into the present day. And what connects all these generations is both that they're a family and they're obviously really connected, but they also are all coming up to this remote Vermont farmhouse called Last House, which is named after the person who built it, John Last, who was the last person to live there before they bought the house from him. And each generation comes to this house and it means something a little different and provides a different kind of escape and a different kind of connection for each of them.
Great. You just mentioned the title, the significance being not meaning last as in final, but named after the person who bought the house, created the house to begin with. So, but it really works. The title's so good because it works on multiple levels. Can you talk about other ways you think that works? And if you had any other titles considered?
Oh, good question. Well, there's sort of funny story about other titles, which is that for a long time, the working title on my, on the file on my computer was Garuda, because there is this little figurine that's kind of a statuette, I guess is a better word for it, in the house that factors in. And in the beginning, I was calling it the Garuda, which is what this sort of, it's an Indonesian kind of gargoyle-like figure. Mm-hmm. And it keeps coming up in different ways in the book. By the end of the 7 years I spent writing Last House, the Garuda has morphed into an Iranian figure called the Simurg because it fit better with it. And so obviously I couldn't call it Garuda, but in addition to that, my editor was like, that we cannot call this book Garuda. That cannot be the title.
It doesn't really roll off the tongue, and it's going to be, people are going to stand there in the bookstore going, what was that title again?
Right. It was, and then I realized it's also the name of the Indonesian airline Garuda. So anyway, that was a big misnomer. I didn't really answer your question though, your first question about how I came to write this book. So I can tell you a little about that. I told you a little about what it's about. But I came to it because I had been, for the last 7 years, I seem to spend about 7 years writing my books, for better or worse. there are pros and cons to that. But my last book, The Women in the Castle, took me a long time to write, and I had spent all this time thinking about what it was like to be German after World War II.
Mm.
And that was, I learned a lot about that. I spent a lot of time inhabiting what it was like to be a character who was coming out of World War II, what it was like to live with the complicity and the shame of being German, to live in a defeated nation. And by the end of that time, I really had started to think about the flip side of that, which is, what was it like to be American after World War II?
Mhm.
And out of that question, which, the short answer to that is, it was like the exact opposite of being German. Not only was America victorious after World War II, but we really were ratified in all of the things that we felt our country stood for. And it was like, I mean, America came through that war smelling like a rose in terms of how we exited it. And I think it's probably the time that we as a nation were the most cohered around a sense of American rightness. And I kind of thought, well, how did that play out? In the same way that I was thinking about, how did the German sense of shame and defeat play out in these individual characters' lives? I wanted to explore, how did that American sense of rightness and mission play out in individual characters and families' lives? So that was sort of the big picture of how I came to write this. But then there's also a little seed story that I can tell you, which
Yeah.
was, my own family has a house in Vermont, and at some point I was going up there. It belonged to my grandparents. It belongs to my dad now. I was going up there with my kids some years ago, and a friend who knows Vermont said, "Oh, isn't that the valley that all the old CIA guys go to retire to?" And this was the first time I'd ever heard anything like that. I have no idea if there's any truth to it or not, but I'm a fiction writer, so I took that seed and I started playing it out in my mind. What would it be like? What would a little village in a remote place of ex-CIA agents
Mhm.
be like, and why would they have ended up there, and what would it be providing them?
Yeah, and it's done so well, and I loved imagining that and thinking that. It's sort of like, okay, we know about like the snowbirds who go to Florida, but where do the CIA, the ex-CIA agents go? And it's like, clearly this place in Vermont, I can totally imagine it. Can you tell us a bit about oil, which I noticed actually in the second like reading of it, that last house, or The Age of Oil, which I hadn't noticed as a subtitle, but I did, of course, see the way the book opens. If everybody can see that, it's just a catalog of all of the products, or many of the products made from oil. So, can you talk about oil in this book?
Yeah, well, in that, thinking about what was it like to be American after World War II, and the American sense of optimism and rightness and growth, you know, at the heart of all of that is oil. It started to seem like I couldn't not write about that. And I started to think about this time period that we are living in, and that for many people, I think right now we feel is kind of like tentative, or tenuous rather. And we're kind of aware of endings, because we know we have to wean ourselves from fossil fuels in order to stop climate change. So I kind of was thinking about, that's where we are now. You could say the word oil, and it's almost, for many people, it's sort of almost a dirty word. Like, it feels like this is something, a terrible force on our planet. And but the beginning of this time period after World War II, that was the opposite. Oil seemed like this amazing,
Mhm.
emblem of, it was like the currency of progress, because there was so much technology and life that could be developed in better ways because of oil. So I started to kind of think about, like, well, we have the Stone Age and the Bronze Age, and it's like, the Machine Age, and each of these periods you think of as defined by that thing that it's named
Mhm.
after. And in my own mind, I was just thinking about this last sort of 80 years as the age of oil, and that is where that came from. And then when I started to research oil as a shaping force of American or of modern life, really in general, it was just amazing to me how deeply it is embedded in the core of our being, not only in the things that we like to do, like our, we wouldn't be connected as a global world without all of the fuel that drives cars and cargo ships and airplanes. We wouldn't have suburbs if we didn't have cars. We wouldn't have cars if we didn't have gas. There's all of that I already knew, but then, or I hadn't thought about, but it was sort of obvious. But then when you start thinking about plastic, and I came across this list of things, products that are partially derived from oil, and it is like endless. And I can just read you like a tiny bit from that to give you a taste of it.
Yeah.
It could have been, it's as you showed, it's like this. Could have been so much longer. Electric blankets, rubber cement, fishing boots, house paint, water pipes, hand lotion. It's like it is so, petroleum products are really, really deeply in our lives. And there is, I feel that there's almost like we're at the cusp of a kind of nostalgia about that as we sort of wean ourselves.
Yeah, can we wean ourselves? Yeah. Really, we're inextricably linked to this now, and sort of dangerously reliant on countries who, have all the oil or much of the oil. So it was such an interesting extra character in the book. But let's talk about characters now, starting with Nick Taylor at the beginning of the book. He is on an airplane on his way as a lawyer to negotiate a deal in terms of oil and America and the Middle East. And just tell us about him and his family.
Yeah. So I have the funny situation of having grandparents myself, my real life grandparents, who actually fought on both sides of World War II. And the women in the castle, I really spent, was very much like my German grandparents provided kind of a jumping off point for my interest in that and that experience of being German. And my American grandparents were kind of in my mind and also functioned as a sort of, certainly my characters are not based on them, but inspired by them. And that, so these two characters of Nick and Bette Taylor were very much, I took some of the circumstances I knew of my grandparents' lives and created them in my imagination and recreated people who were totally different than my grandparents to inhabit them. The circumstances that they share with my grandparents are that Nick Taylor is a World War II veteran. He was in the Marines. He fought in the Pacific. He never speaks about that, not to his wife, not to his children. It's a very closely guarded part of himself. He comes home. He's a self-made man. He grew up in very poor circumstances in the Midwest. But after the war, he comes back on the GI Bill. He goes to law school. He becomes an international oil lawyer. And he's really caught up in the sort of idealistic, patriotic premise of helping shore up oil and also putting, of helping shore up oil, but also of conveying American values. And he's a real idealist. But he has a whole part of his life that he kind of keeps a bit secret from his wife and from the rest of his family, which is both his war experience and what he ends up doing and gets sucked into at the beginning of Last House, which is some work that is sort of loosely part of the CIA. He's not in the CIA, but he ends up helping the CIA with a plot that they are unfolding in the Middle East. And then his wife, Bette, is also shares a circumstance with my grandmother. My grandmother was a code breaker during World War II when
Oh,
after she
cool.
graduated from college. And that's also something she never spoke about. So I never had the chance to hear anything about this from her, but it's sort of in our family lore. And I thought, I'll make this character who has that background and in that way get to know my grandmother a little better. So it was fascinating doing that research. But anyway, Bet has gone meets Nick when she's in the when she's working for the Navy as a code breaker, and she falls in love. He's at war. They get married very quickly, as many people of that time did. They have a child. He comes back from war, and suddenly their lives are on these really different trajectories because his is all kind of upward from after the war. The GI Bill sort of sets him up to move forward in life. And for her, it's a little different because she, as a woman, is much more bounded by the traditional experience of what's expected of her as a mother and a wife. And so she's had this really intellectual experience of being a code breaker, but she goes from that to being a 1950s housewife.
Mm-hmm.
So those are the first two characters, and then we follow the next set of characters. Their daughter Catherine was really different from either of them, and is really rebelling against the sort of traditional stiff upper lip way of being in the world that her parents have, and she gets really involved in the kind of a sort of radical element of the protest movements of the late 60s.
Can you talk now then about the second part, which really is focused on Catherine and her brother, and how you decided to really set this largely during the Columbia protests of 68 to 71-ish. How did you get interested in it, and how did you decide to place characters near that radical fringe, which was particularly interesting because I read this during the Columbia protests this spring and was like, oh my God, like Jessica's like so good at predicting the future and showing us the past. And one of the things I, love most about historical fiction is when it does that, when it highlights the now and the conflicts of now by putting them up against the conflicts of then. Obviously you couldn't have predicted that, but just your choices and
yeah, I mean, it is like, I think anyone who writes historical fiction gets kind of experiences the truism of history repeats itself in so many different ways. But certainly I had no idea how much it would be repeating itself, as it has been with the protest movement of now. But why I situated it there was, as I started thinking about that time and this generational conflict between the kind of greatest generation and their baby boomer kids, and Catherine is a representative of that, I felt like I felt very aware in my own understanding of the 60s. I felt like I was fairly aware of the civil rights movement and pieces of that. I learned about that in school. It was very much a part of things that we talk about now. It's ongoing. And the early anti-war movement, but I wasn't really very aware of what I ended up getting really into for this book through my research, which was this really radical sort of offshoot of those more mainstream movements, where by 1970, you had the Weathermen, and there were kind of these fringe groups that were really frustrated by the lack of change, despite all the years of protesting and marching and that to me was like, I thought it was really interesting that for some people there was this shift at that time and a kind of turn to violence. And I came across the statistic about, I think between 1970 and 71, there was an 18-month period where there were almost 2,000 domestic bombings on US soil. Very few casualties. I think maybe literally only like 2, because these were small scale bombings of government buildings at night and stuff, but they were kind of attention grabbing. And they were really controversial within the movement, because there were a lot of people who were like, that now you're just becoming the bad guys, like this is not for us. So I was interested in that moment of like where a character has to make a choice and make a change, or make a choice and decide whether they're, you know, what the boundaries of their activism are and what direction it leads them. And so that was kind of how I ended up situating Catherine in that scene. And I love to read memoirs. I love to read books about the period I'm writing about. And it was it was just so distinct and interesting to read about these activists in the late 60s, early 70s, in around Columbia, and all the underground newspapers and magazines they had. I have the character of Catherine ends up
Right, right,
writing for one of them, and that was its whole own little research rabbit hole
right.
that I got to go down.
I loved that part. I liked really imagining a character, what would make someone go there and do that, especially coming from this suburban childhood that she was raised with her parents seemingly so sort of neat and you know buttoned up, but really each having their own past and their own story too. Can you talk about research a bit, especially? Um, what's your research process, and as a non-historian, how you approach writing historical fiction? Which I know that's two questions, but
Yeah,
match them together.
yeah. Well, my research process is, could probably be streamlined substantially,
You
but
said
I
of
kind
the
of love,
7 years, is that
yeah.
including research or no?
Including research,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. So I guess what I would say is that once I've decided on a time period and kind of scope that I'm interested in, I start by doing some a good amount of reading just to get myself situated and think about the themes and the issues that I want to explore in it. And that's sort of a preliminary. That's before I start writing. But then, once I've kind of got a sense of who my characters are and what some of the periods that I want them to be, what some of the currents I want them to be navigating are, then it becomes like I research and write at the same time. It's sort of a little bit of writing, and then that will take me to a place where there's I have a question about something, and then I'll have to turn to research again, and then I'll do a little research, and then the research will give me, I'll learn some other really interesting fact, and I'll want to include that in the writing, and then I'll go back, and that will fuel some writing. So each kind of fuels the other, and they're in combination. But yeah, I feel like anyway, I think that for me, research is like, as a historical research as a non-historian is so interesting to me from the psychological point of view, because I think of history as sort of our collective psychology. And I think all novelists are always interested in psychology, or most are. Anyway, maybe I'll speak for myself. I'm interested in psychology of my characters. And so when I started kind of thinking about like history in that vein, it just adds even another layer of interest for me. That's kind of, this is our collective experience. How is that shaping our current psychology?
Right. Yeah, it's a really it was fun to do that deep dive and in seeing that in each of these characters, but also doing that myself. And I know Tori Whitaker is here. She's a fellow historical novelist too, and she said there's such a great abundance of research reflected in this novel. And we have some regulars here too, so I want to shout them out, like Renee Herskowitz, who since she's happy that so much of the research of code breaking brought you closer to the memory of your grandfather, and like the idea of getting to know characters, but also perhaps the American psyche and also the people in your own family better as well.
Yeah, there's sort of I feel like it's kind of a lucky thing if you choose subjects to write about that connect to your own family history, because it's fiction and I'm inventing these characters, but the circumstances that are circumstances people I have known and loved lived through are suddenly so much more vivid for me, and it creates an extra level of understanding. So I feel like that has worked out well for me.
That's fantastic. I want to open it up to questions from the audience, and I also want to say hi to Sharon Person because I see her here too, and I didn't get to shout her out earlier. Hi from Minnesota, as she said. So, okay, Renee, who did you dedicate this book to?
So I dedicated this book to my father because it's his parents who were sort of, as I said, the jumping off point for me exploring the characters in this book. And because I also think on some levels, this book was a real way. I was writing this partly during COVID, and there's a lot of me trying to kind of understand how are we where we are today in America? And I think my interest in that kind of question comes 100% from being raised in the house with my father and mother, but both of them were very engaged in like what does it mean to be part of this world, and how do the pieces fit together on a kind of larger and somewhat political level. So it made sense to me to dedicate it to him.
Cool. Is there a book or author that inspires you?
Oh, many. You would think I would have like a perfect answer at this point because I've been asked this so many times, but each time it's like, what mood am I in today? There's so many. I love Dickens. I love plot in a book. I also love being internally located in character psychology, and I feel like he really does that in such a wonderful way. I was just rereading David Copperfield, as I'm sure many people have after reading Barbara
I read
Kingsolver's
it. Yeah,
yeah.
I did it before.
Yeah, I had read it like
Copperhead.
so long ago and barely remembered it. And I was rereading it, and just there were so many passages I was like underlining, like this is just amazing the way he's inside Pip's head and getting so that's one such writer. I really admire Kate Atkinson. And the way she also, I think, keeps the pages, she keeps you turning the pages with a lot of plot, but she's also got so many astute observations about her characters' psychology.
Great. I see a question from Tori that we'll do it after because it's my question too. What subject have you found was most challenging to write about?
Oh, interesting. Well, in this book, I would say, I would say that the CIA plot that I sort of got my character of Nick situated for the sort of set some things in motion here. That was probably the hardest thing I wrote in this book, just because I had to do that was the most intensive research because I really didn't know anything about that. And it's in Iran, and it involves a coup that overthrew Mohammad Mossadegh, and it's pretty complex. And it was like each thing that I would learn about led to something else that I didn't know about that I had to learn about. And then also finding a way to write about that so that it was exciting to me, because you never want to, you have to find your way in. And for me, that was, I actually came across the description of this amazing, fantastically crazy party in 1971 that was thrown by the Shah of Iran. It was called the Persepolis Party, and he made a big deal of it being the biggest party the world has ever seen. And he erected a whole city of silken tents around the ruins, and he flew in caviar and champagne from Paris. He flew in all the wait staff from Maxime's restaurant in Paris. He flew in songbirds to cheep from the trees that he had planted along the road that he had. It was like, once I started reading about that, and I saw I could, the internet being what it is, you're like 2 clicks away from pictures of this fantastical party and Grace Kelly coming in, and I knew I had to set a scene there. And it was like, so it's part of the research and part of the challenge was finding those things that are like that I can grab onto. I'm not going to set any scenes really in like these boardrooms that a lot of what was unfolding was taking place in, but finding the places around the edges that I was excited to get into.
Yeah, that I wanna go. I mean, I really have, like, no interest in the desert. Like, I don't really wanna, like, go there. I'd much rather go to, like, a beach with with, like, water. But, that party scene was amazing, and I now really wanna, like, get on a camel and go out to a party in
Yeah.
the
Oh,
desert.
yeah, that was
Where,
the
like,
other right
everything was,
also.
like, kept somehow refrigerated and cold and,
Yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that little piece of research was really fun for me because I actually got to do that, not in Iran because it was not I would have loved to go visit, but it's in a total do not visit period during the time that I've been writing this book. So I kept trying to figure out if I could. I couldn't go over there, but I did go to the Middle East, and I was able to take a one of these like camel caravan camping trips for 3 days in the desert, and they set up all these tents, and that was like an amazing experience. And then it was really cool to be able to draw on the specifics of the weirdness of things like having ice in a
Yeah.
gin and tonic in the
Yeah.
desert. Yeah.
I mean, that's great,
Scorpions.
and how much fun. That's like the kind of research we would all long to do.
Yeah, that was very lucky. I have to I
Yeah.
feel very, very lucky to have been able to do that.
Okay, Tori asks, was it challenging to decide how to structure the novel, such as relating much of Catherine's story through her memories or the foreshadowing of the son's story?
Oh, good question.
Yep, you can tell she's a writer.
Yeah, yeah, obviously, right. We're this is writer to writer here. I yes, it was challenging and it evolved enormously. I actually what became the ending of the book, the last section, which is now
Mhm.
like maybe 40 or 50 pages, and it's set in this during this big blackout in a sort of alternate present day world in Last House. I originally pictured that actually being the frame of the book, that it was going to start there and then go back. And then for various reasons, it kind of evolved to be that what I think the shortest answer to that is like I realized that I was most interested in the journey and the beginning of the journey, that sort of the bright ideas and optimism that can sometimes lead to darker endings.
Mhm.
So then the structure shifted accordingly. But there was yes, there was a lot of doing this and trying it one way, then trying it
Mhm.
another, and like every writer, there are hundreds of pages in a weird file on my computer that
Yeah.
I pretend someday I'll come back to, but I who knows? We'll
Yeah,
see.
it's a process. So that leads me to wonder, do you outline how much do you plan ahead of time and how much do you just let the writing happen?
Yeah, I do a kind of combination, which again is probably not the most efficient way to do it, but I tend to kind of have the big idea and I know some scenes that I'm writing towards, such as that party scene we just talked about, the
Mhm.
Persepolis event. And I knew I wanted to have these characters. I wanted to have the character of Nick come to Iran with all of his sort of idealism and patriotism of the early 50s in the middle of the Cold War, and then kind of see how the plot that he becomes a part of unfolds and kind of have a little bit of a reckoning with what he thinks when he sees where it ended. So I have sort of an arc, I guess, is what I'm saying, not so much an outline, but often what happens for me anyway is that like I'll write the first almost 100 pages pretty quickly. I mean, I'm a very slow writer, as as you can tell from how long it takes,
Okay.
but for me, pretty quickly. Um, and then it's kind of like, okay, now I really need to, I usually get to sort of a sticking point around page 90 or 100. And it's like, okay, now I really need to step back and think about the big picture. How
Mhm.
is this all unfolding? Where's it going to go? How do I set things up? And then I kind of end up doing not exactly an outline, but almost like a table of contents, which is constantly shifting, but I have it as a document on my computer that I'm cutting and paste, I'm working on it, and I'll update it as I go, and I'll change it, and I'll swap things around a little.
Right, like a living document
Yeah, yeah,
can change according to,
yeah,
yeah, they speak to each other, sort of.
yeah.
Right. Okay. Renee asks, what would you like the reader to take away from reading your book?
Oh, um, What would I like them? Well, first and foremost, I would really just like them to have a transporting experience, because that's what I want from any book that I read, is just to be able to step into it and have the writing rise up the off the page to meet me in such a way that I'm there and I'm just, it's going and I'm in it, and it's like a movie that I'm watching in my head. And so I hope to have done that. I hope that there's enough plot, and I work hard to try to make sure that the characters feel very real, but there's also the pacing and the forward motion keeps you in it. But then on another level, I guess I did think there is a part of me that wants to think about this role, that how we embraced oil and how that unfolded, and that also wants to think about, would like to have people think about kind of this sort of fear of endings that a lot of us have now, but think about it in the context of the whole last 80 years, where while I was researching and writing about it, it struck me that each of these characters in all of these time periods has had moments of really existential angst. You know, with Bet, it was like nuclear war in the 50s. With Catherine, there's the upheaval and rioting and unrest that sometimes seems poised to shake up America completely. So I guess I feel like that's something that um, that I took away from the writing process, and that not exactly comforting, but a little bit like reassuring that we as human beings often are afraid of the end of the world and
Yeah.
afraid of endings. It's not right
Sometimes.
now, right?
More,
Not always, but
sometimes more than others. Right.
yes,
Yeah.
sometimes more than others. True.
Writing during
Kind of
COVID,
it ebbs and flows.
right? Political situations, COVID. So whether it's like, what's going to get us to, like, is it going to be, a war, an international sort of situation? Is it going to be a blackout and what the ramifications are of a huge blackout, et cetera, et cetera. But I did feel hopeful at the end of the book, and I did come away with the sense that humanity will survive or endure. Fingers crossed. And I liked that. I thought it was realistic, but hopeful, and I liked the glimmer, like the moving just like a little bit forward from now to give us that sense. Because in the now, we can't say that everything's going to be okay, but the way you do it, going like pushing forward a bit, which not to this point of being speculative, but just that little nudge to the future gives us kind of hope. I like to
I'm
think.
glad. I think of it as hopeful.
Yeah, very much so. I want to ask just one more question that I did see float by from Tori, which is about the cover. And we'll end with that, this gorgeous cover. I happen to know the story. I think it's wonderful. And I'd love for you to share with us a bit about the cover of Last House.
Yeah, I love that cover. It's really my favorite of all my book covers. And it was commissioned from my publisher commissioned it from an artist who lives in Spain, and he's Spanish. So he actually was given some chunks of text from the book that related to what the valley is like, what the house is like, and the sort of feeling. And I love that he was able to translate them into this beautiful painting. And another cool thing that at some point I'll put on social media when I get organized, but he sent us sketches along the way.
Yeah.
And so it was really cool to see his process and how he works. And one little piece that to me, who, I'm not a painter, I'm a painting appreciator, but I was really interested to see how one part of his process, once he'd gotten the sketch down, he had sort of almost collaged, there's probably a different word for it, but different real images, like a real city, real trees, a real house here. And he put them all together in this kind of collage. And then he hangs that on the wall and he paints that. So he's created this, this.
Yeah.
That was like a really neat element. And I love it so much that I actually was able to get the painting from him. I have that on my pile to bring to the framer and get hung up.
Great. I love that you have this art for your home.
Yeah.
Where are you going to put it? Do you know?
Yeah, good question.
Maybe from, like,
I think in my living room.
things to
I want to
structural.
share it.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's like I could put it in my office, but I'm also like, maybe it needs.
Yeah.
I need it right in the kitchen.
It's like better than one of those posters that's made on the
Yeah,
the foam core poster of
right,
the book cover.
right,
Much
right.
better to have the original artwork
Yeah.
hanging in one's home. Well, this has just been wonderful, Jessica. Thank you so much for joining us on A Mighty Blaze today, and thank you to everybody who came and placed comments and questions in the chat. Um,
Thank you.
oh, you're
This
welcome.
was so much fun to do, and I so appreciate it. So, and thank you all for being here.
Yeah, thanks everybody, and we will see you again soon on A Mighty Blaze.